Okay, we were just talking about those big branches of life that all have the characteristics of living things. So here they are: animals, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, and archaea. So let's talk about how we came to develop this system of taxonomy and organization and naming of living things. Well, first of all, a living thing is called an organism. And those organisms can be simple, like a single cell, or they can be more complicated, where cells of a similar type build into layers called tissues, and those tissues layer, fold, or otherwise join together, and they form a common purpose in an organ. And organs that connect to accomplish other larger interconnected physiological tasks, they are called organ systems, and organ systems build into an organism. Groups of organisms that are similar enough to breed and produce fertile offspring are called a species. Sometimes members of two different species can mate, but they produce a hybrid. So that would be something like a mule from a horse and a donkey. These animal hybrids can represent the best of their two parent species, like being intelligent and strong and less stubborn, but they're often infertile because their chromosomes don't pair up nicely. More on that when we talk about mitosis and meiosis. Some of the plant hybrids can actually continue to reproduce. Plants can do this crazy thing called polyploidy, where they have more than just the chromosomes from their immediate parents, and the chromosome numbers build every year. So that's pretty cool. So they have more than two copies of each chromosome. All right, back to the hierarchy. So members of the same species living in a certain place, they're called a population. If you combine many populations, you have a group of biotic or living things called a community. When you add in the abiotic factors to the community, you have an ecosystem. And ecosystems are grouped worldwide by their defining characteristics into biomes. And then there's the biosphere, and that's all of the earth capable of supporting life. And life in its great diversity can occupy environments which we as humans would think really extreme, like hot sulfur springs or inside clouds or on a dust particle. There's some crazy places you find living things, and that's all the biosphere. Of course, those extreme environments require some very specific traits. And those are all found in one major branch of life's tree. But where did this idea of life as a branching tree come from anyway? Well, it relates to the naming and grouping of organisms, and that started with Aristotle. He was the first of many naturalists to group organisms based on their characteristics. So organisms were placed into taxa, or groups, and that planted the seeds of what we now know as taxonomy, the study of naming and classifying organisms. The system that he used, and many after him used as well, they would group some, like all the flying animals would go together, and all the swimming animals would go together, and that's a very outdated way of looking at classification, but he did start something that has stuck with us, and that is the idea that you start with a large group and you get progressively more specific as you go on. And so he used two categories, the genus and the species, and those names have stuck too. But we are going to talk about Carl Linnaeus. Both of them have kind of laid down the groundwork for modern taxonomy. They both used a broad category, and they both used a specific category. And there were a range of categories in between for Carl Linnaeus's grouping system. So the Linnaean classification system used the names of taxa that we still use today. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. He consistently used Latin because he was trying to create a system that everyone worldwide could use so that everyone would have the same name for the same organism, because at the time, scientists worldwide were calling the same organism by many different names. And so what he did was he took the genus and the species name, and that became the binomial scientific name of the organism. And we call that system of naming, which we still use, binomial nomenclature, which is short for the two-name naming system. So with this naming system, humans are Homo sapiens, our research organism, the spotted salamander, they're Ambystoma maculatum, and mice are Mus musculus. And that's the common house mouse, because there are lots of mice and rats out there. I just want to point out right now, all of these names have something in common. First of all, the first letter of the genus is capitalized, and secondly, the entire scientific name or binomial name is written in italics. Using this system, we can track how similar different organisms are, and how many groups they share in common with related organisms or similar organisms. So let's use a domestic dog, and let's take a look at this. So domestic dogs, they are animals, and they all are multicellular, they're eukaryotic, they consume other organisms for energy. So this group is huge. It's going to include all the insects, fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals on the planet. Domestic dogs are also chordates. They have a notochord, which is a hollow dorsal nerve cord, and a tail for some part of their lifetimes. All animals with vertebrae are included, but this is still pretty broad. We even include sea squirts, and there's some debate over whether even sea cucumbers should be included in this group. Domestic dogs are also mammals, so they have hair and mammary glands and middle ear bones and a brain that regulates their body temperature. They're called endothermic amniotes, and that differentiates them from reptiles and birds, which have amniotic eggs, but they're not in this group. They are not warm-blooded. They don't have some of those other features that I talked about. Domestic dogs are carnivorans. So up to this point, humans would have belonged in each of the earlier taxa, but we diverge off here. So the domestic dogs as a carnivoran, they can be exclusively carnivores, but there's bears in this group, and some pandas are almost exclusively herbivores. But in this group, the things they share in common, they're going to be terrestrial, have sharp claws, prominent canine teeth, cheek teeth with cutting edges, and 4 to 5 toes per foot. So you're looking at badgers, raccoons, bears, seals. So they're not all terrestrial, mostly terrestrial, skunks, wolves, dogs, and foxes. More specifically, they're canids. And so we're looking at wolves, dogs, and foxes now. And then at the genus level, in Canis, we exclude the foxes. And so you've still got wolves, coyotes, jackals, dogs, and dingoes. Canis lupus is actually the Latin name for the gray wolf. In 2005, there were 37 subspecies of gray wolf, and that includes our domestic dog breeds, and those fall under the name Canis lupus familiaris. And so that's actually a trinomial name and includes an even more specific group called the subspecies. And there's all kinds of subclasses that have been added to these groupings. And I also want to give a shout out to Wikipedia right now, because that's where I got all of this information. They are a great source for taxonomic information. And also a little shout out to my sister. That is her dog Ellie. They're being featured as our example. The Linnaean system is really great, but it doesn't exactly tell us how organisms are related. It just gives us an idea of how similar organisms look or behave. Often the more categories in the kingdom to species list that you share, the more you're related. But then there's that whole hiccup of the fact that living in similar environments through evolution can shape organisms that look and behave similarly, and they're not related at all. And that's a concept called convergent evolution, which we'll get to later. But that's another story for another lesson. I want to talk about phylogenetics. The sequencing of whole genomes, all the DNA containing the instructions for an individual. So that's the genome. That sequencing has given us a quantifiable way to analyze differences in organisms. This new technology has completely rewired the way we think about relatedness, because those earlier classification systems were always based on grouping or clades. We often call those methods cladistics now, but this is brand new. It's kind of shaking up the tree of life, and so now we're relying on both. We have cladistics for some of the fossil evidence we're uncovering, and we have phylogenetics for the existing animals that we have DNA evidence for. As more genetic analyses were completed, especially a set of analyses of the DNA that codes for ribosomes that was done by Carl Woese, the scientific community started to debate and finally accept that the kingdom as the broadest category was really doing a terrible job of representing life's diversity, because 4 of the kingdoms, that would be your animal, your plant, your produce, your fungi, they shared more in common than we thought, while those pesky little microbes that I find so fascinating showed just incredible amounts of diversity in their DNA. So a new taxa, which is called the domain, was born out of necessity. We needed to show that archaea or archaebacteria, eubacteria, they were so different that they had their own branch. And then the eukarya, which encompassed those 4, that had the diversity seen in just one of the 2 bacterial domains. And so just, again, to note that archaea kingdom, the name is kind of, it gets interchanged sometimes. So again, just to recap, you're looking at broad to very specific categories. So as you get smaller and smaller, you have fewer numbers of species there. Starting with domain now, ending with species. So I hate to encourage memorization over understanding, but this is one of those things you're going to have to memorize, domain to species in order. And so I've got a little mnemonic device to help you there. This was not created by me, but it has always helped my students out, and that is dumb kids playing chase on freeways get squished. And so if you use those letters, you can help yourself remember domain through species in order. And of course, you can sub in the S word of your choice: squished, smashed, smushed. So, on that note, the first lesson of biology class is over. Congratulations, you made it.